Hey guys, welcome to the inaugural episode of Den of Sin. That is CIN. If you're not seeing this spelled out on your Spotify or iTunes search. But yeah, this is our very first episode. I'm glad to have you guys listening. My name is James, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, my good friend Devin.
Hello.
So, Devin, when we talked about doing this podcast, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I'm pretty familiar with your tastes and the things that you're super passionate about. In fact, historically, you've turned me on to things, some of my favorite things in life, whether it's hearing Nielsen music or, there's so much, it's hard to mention, but you've always been somebody who I would say, I possess what many people in my life has referred to as a childlike enthusiasm about things, and I get very excited about things. And really, when I like something, I get whole hog into it. And it's not a common characteristic I find in adult men, but one thing I've always loved about you, Devin, is you've always had that same level of enthusiasm, and you really follow something, with your whole spirit. And so, with Tom, he was very infectious. Like if you have a conversation with Devin, it's definitely a conversation that you remember. So always appreciate that about you. I know it's hard to find like-minded people, whether it's in film or music. So I've always enjoyed our conversations. And when we talked about doing this podcast, the first thing I thought of was we bandied around some ideas when we started talking about it, but I was like, I think we need to do Burt Reynolds. I think for the first episode we recorded, I was like, I think we got to do Burt. I know you have been a very passionate fan of Burt Reynolds. Do you mind telling me just like the history you have with being a Burt Reynolds fan?
Well, similar to you, I mean, he was the biggest movie star in the world.
Yeah.
The year we were born. And he held that record. The only person that has the longer record was Tom Cruise. Burt Reynolds was in the top 10 highest box office draws from 1973 to 1984. So that's like 11 years of being one of the tops. And for 5 of those years, from 78 to 82, he was number one. And that falls where I was born. So in a lot of ways, he was the image of what a movie star was when I was growing up.
Absolutely.
For several years. And so you just kind of take it for granted. You grow up, oh, Burt Reynolds is on TV.
I'll say before we start recording this, there was a time in my life when he was the only actor whose name I knew. Burt Reynolds was a kid, as like a young kid, I would see people, but the only actor I knew was Burt Reynolds. He was like the only actors whose name I knew. It was like him and Kenny Rogers were the only two men on television whose name I knew.
It's funny you should say that, because I can relate. It was because it was about that same time Cannonball Run was on HBO, around the same time as Six Pack with Kenny Rogers.
That's right.
And I think Burt Reynolds actually cameos in Six Pack.
Probably. I don't remember, but probably.
But of course, to me back then, Cannonball Run was the Captain Chaos show. So.
That's right. I'm with you on that. Was what I always wanted to see.
But, growing up, Burt was always on TV. And then when he wasn't on TV, I think I just kind of tended to forget about him until I was a little bit older and started to watch some stuff with the nostalgic eye towards it, and started to realize there's a little bit more nuance to him than most people think. I mean, I don't think nuance is a word that anybody applies to Burt Reynolds normally.
Not normally, no.
But, because he had one speed. He had Burt Reynolds. But, man, he hit that speed. And he could do it in a way that worked for cheesy action films, but also worked for the romantic comedies and dramas, where he could turn on the charm. And you never felt like it was two different people. It's not that he couldn't wear a tuxedo versus denim. It was that he was the guy who would wear a cowboy hat with the tuxedo, and somehow it worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny because, like, I mean, he's one of those dudes that like he's one of those actors that always had his like he's not, like you said, he's not a chameleon. Like he was not changing between roles. He always sort of seemed like he was always playing Burt Reynolds. You know, obviously, like going back to like his, like even to his TV work and stuff, he was always kind of a very like masculine guy. I think obviously like with Deliverance, he actually, you know, that's a great performance. It's definitely an actual acting performance. He's a little bit more of an actual like character and stuff, but he's sort of. It's funny. I've always sort of thought of him as like the last of the classic, movie stars, like a Clark Gable or whatever. Like he just had that thing where he felt like a movie star. It didn't even matter what movie he was in. Who gives a shit about even what movies he's in? He's Burt Reynolds, and he always brings that to him. And I think one of my things too growing up with him was seeing him. I know like my mom loved Burt Reynolds. I mean, one of her favorite movies was Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and she loved Dolly Parton too. But I remember when he would always show up on Barbara Walters, and he was just always so fucking cool, man. Like all this, even like when he's being like heartfelt and talking about his romance with like Sally Field or whatever, he's still cool. He just oozes cool and charm, and it's just always the image I have in my head.
Yeah, same here. And those talk shows, you know, first off, he dated Dinah Shore.
I know,
who ran the talk show. She's like 20 years older than him, so she was, I guess, one of the first Hollywood cougars. Well,
that's right.
First public, let's say.
Yeah, exactly.
He really credits those talk shows. You know, I remember seeing him on Carson and all that growing up too.
Yeah.
He credits the talk shows for his fame more than his movies.
I believe it.
Well, the way that he kind of put it, and I'm paraphrasing everything here, but the way Burt kind of put it himself was the movies gave people his performance, but the talk shows gave him the personality.
Interesting. Okay.
And so insofar as, like we were saying before, where Burt was kind of always Burt, people realized that he was really that real deal while they were watching him on Johnny Carson, where he was the first non-comedian to guest host The Tonight Show.
Oh, I didn't know that. Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
really.
Before that, it had all been Joan Rivers, Jerry Lewis, Don Rickles.
Exactly.
Finishing up obviously with Jay Leno, but I can't think. I'm not sure if any other non-comedians ever hosted the Tonight Show. That might be debatable, but he was certainly the first non-comedian to host the Tonight Show.
Well, it's funny because I remember, when we were kind of like, looking up some stuff about him. And he did have a quote, and I'm also going to paraphrase, but basically saying, like, he's the only movie star to become a movie star despite his movies. Like, he didn't become a movie star because of his movies. Like, his movies didn't even matter. And I was like, I can totally see that. Like, that's kind of true. I mean, obviously, like, Smokey and the Bandit, Campbell Run were his, like, huge films when we were growing up. So, I mean, to me, I always do have an image of him in a cowboy hat, being cool and, being in a fast, vehicle or whatever.
Doing that laugh.
Exactly. That fucking $1 million laugh. And that's the thing is, man, he's, I think he doesn't get enough credit for actually his comedic timing is fucking amazing. Especially if you watch, like, notoriously all those films have the sort of, the bloopers at the end of the films. His comedic timing is like, dude, he was very funny, but, he was always funny in the realm of who he was. Like, he was never going to give up his cool, for anything. So he let Dom DeLuise and other people play the fool, and he was always still going to be the cool guy. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, like, he's for me, it was definitely a thing of, like, when we were preparing to do this, like, I was like, oh, I'm a Burt Reynolds fan. Like, I know his films. And then I looked at the breadth of his work and was like, holy shit, I haven't seen like half of these. Like, and then that's when I knew, like
Boogie Nights is more mid-career than anything else. It's kind of crazy to think.
That's crazy to think about. Well, we'll touch on Boogie Nights at some point because there's more I want to talk about that subject.
Yeah, we'll have to. That's one of the best. Yeah,
and then even like his relationship with that movie, which is very complex, which is I find super fascinating. But let me ask you this: so obviously, like I said, he was ambiguous at the time. Like, you couldn't escape Burt Reynolds in the 80s. But so you were saying about how, like, you sort of kind of came back to his work. Was there a specific movie that sort of made you kind of like go, oh shit, I forgot what a badass Burt Reynolds was, or sort of got you onto that the going down that road of wanting to invest more time on his work? And
there were a couple of steps to it, to be honest. I always loved Smokey and the Bandit.
Yeah, of course.
But I got to say,
I have to laugh. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. For our listeners, a cat was just walking on Devin's head.
That's
so
what she
the
does.
That's the unofficial guest host of this podcast. Anyway, sorry, Devin. That was
it's all good. Hey, if you weren't distracted by that, you weren't human.
All right. Full disclosure, I do have a weakness for cats. So.
But I would say with my re-exposure to Burt Reynolds, I kind of want to say it started with Malone, but it's not. I'm almost ashamed of that. Because Malone is one of those ones that you churn through the $5 bin at Big Lots, and once you get past the first 3 Chuck Norris movies, you might find Malone on the bottom there. It is not a great film. He's actually even stated that he did that movie so that people didn't think he was dying of AIDS at the time.
But I will say, though, I'm glad you brought up Malone, because that was a big thing in our group of friends for a long time, was that trailer, quoting the trailer.
Ex-cop.
I think it was the trailer.
Ex-cop, ex-CIA, explosive.
Hey, Malone, you got a first name? Yeah. So good.
So not his best work, but man, it's still a fun movie. I mean, his worst work is still enjoyable.
Absolutely.
So I mean, that kind of got me into Burt again. But then pretty soon after 3 or 4 years within that, Boogie Nights came out, and that really got me looking again, because I was for the first time aware that he actually did have dramatic chops, even though he displayed them when I was younger. I hadn't seen any of that stuff. I hadn't seen Starting Over or any of that. I hadn't even seen Deliverance yet at that point, I don't think. But Boogie Nights kind of opened my eyes to how good he could be. And I think the final nail in that coffin was there was a time where I was sitting around on the couch. I may or may not have had a bottle in front of me. In fact, let's just go ahead and not beat around the bush. I had a bottle in front of me.
Of course.
I'm sitting with our friend Ben, who used to practically live in my house, and Gator happened to be on like TNT, and I hadn't seen Gator since I was a kid, and so we're like, yeah, why the hell not? Burt Reynolds goes with whiskey, and Ben pointed out, it'd be really cool if somebody tried to make one of these movies again, but actually made a good one. I actually ended up getting a little defensive. I was like, I don't think this is a bad movie. I don't think this is one of the bad Burts. And I was right. It was one of the good Burts. But after that, I started to develop more of a fascination with them, because I almost took that as a challenge. How can I write something that has the oomph of Gator, but for a more modern audience? And so that was really where I kicked into overdrive, and I started to watch everything with Burt and became, I don't know if there's such a thing as a Burt scholar, but I could probably sit and talk about him with Lonnie Anderson and know more than she does. So, but
well,
that
I'll
was
say
kind of
this,
the evolution.
Though. I will say that, it's I think for a lot of people, Boogie Nights was that film where sort of like, oh shit. Well, first off, even remembered who he was to a degree, because by that point in the late '90s, mid. I guess
97, like late Oscar season of '97.
Perfect. Yeah. So I think at that point, a lot of people were just like, oh yeah, actually, I remember Burt Reynolds. And he's amazing in it. I mean, the character legitimately breaks your heart in moments, and like, it's such a great performance. And just knowing that he hates it, or hated it, rest in peace, but knowing that he had this contentious relationship with the movie upsets me to this day. I was getting mad about it literally like 2 hours ago when I was like sort of thinking about it. It's like, how do you hate that role and that movie? But even if you just were to take a step back and just look at the movie as far as his performance, like if I'm Burt Reynolds and looking at my performance, I'd be like, yeah, I fucking crushed it in this. But he just disowned the movie. I still don't. I have some weird puritanical, I don't even fully know, but
I don't understand it either. I think a lot of it had to do with P.T. Anderson. I know for a fact he didn't get along with P.T. Anderson. And I think that he had such a terrible experience making the movie. I know he turned it down like 7 times. And
I didn't know that he turned it down that much.
I only found this out this week when I was researching it. He turned it down like 7 times, and then finally Anderson cornered him in a hotel room for the 8th pitch. And Burt got so mad, he just started screaming at him. He became Super Burt. But P.T. Anderson took it all in stride, all the yelling and the screaming, and then waited for Burt to be done, and then said, now, if you do that for my movie, you'll be nominated for an Oscar. And that was what turned Burt. He said, okay, I guess I can do that for your movie. That, like, he saw where he was going with it. And they didn't get along on set, and I can't imagine Burt being too fond of being the second fiddle to all these newcomers. I don't think he passed the torch very gracefully on a personal level. Obviously, the performance was fantastic. An odd sort of thing I did realize that this covers Boogie Nights and Deliverance. And Deliverance, he acknowledged was his favorite movie of his. I think it's Boogie Nights and Deliverance in terms of the best Burt Reynolds performance.
Absolutely.
And what's interesting about him, it's 2 movies where he didn't carry the movie. He was not the lead.
No, he was, yep.
And it feels like an insult, but it's not.
Well, the thing is, in both those roles, he's instead of trying to basically charm his way through the movies, trying to Burt Reynolds his way through the movies, he actually has to let the other actors sort of like play up the other actors, rely on the other actors, and be a character. That's and the thing is, he's really good at it. It was just, he definitely, the one thing, and it was even apparent to me as a young man, is that he definitely had a very healthy ego. He definitely thought a lot about himself. At that point, how do you not? Especially is very much loved by these ladies, and very successful. So, I will say, just to divert a little bit on the P.T. Anderson thing, like, I think maybe a lot of it too might have been age, because the same way I think, like, regardless of same thing with Royal Tannenbaums, with Wes Anderson and Gene
Hackman.
Yeah, Gene Hackman, the very contentious relationship. And I think that a lot of it too is maybe just you have these older actors who are just having to listen to this 20-nothing-year-old fucking director. But also both gave amazing performances in great movies. I will say, though, I used to think, I will give P.T. Anderson this. I always thought of him as this sort of highfalutin, artisty, sort of brilliant auteur kind of guy. And then listening to him on Mark Maron's podcast for the first time, I was like, oh, he's like a normal guy. He likes dick and fart jokes, and he's not the guy I thought he was, which was pretty great. Much more down to earth than I would have thought for the guy that made Phantom Thread and that There Will Be Blood.
Definitely.
But yeah, to get back on the Burt thing. So you had mentioned basically a few minutes ago in passing that you were inspired by Ben, sort of saying somebody should make one of these, but good. And then you mentioned that you took that as a challenge. So obviously you're a writer. I've known you for a long time. You've always had a lot of lots of ideas going, a lot of scripts that you're working on.
We've always bonded on the fact we're both artists.
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
that was always a link between us.
Absolutely. As somebody who is obviously you're a screenwriter, you're passionate about that art form. When we can touch upon more of that later. But my question, how do you approach a Burt Reynolds, a quote unquote Burt Reynolds kind of movie, and what would you say when you're sitting down to write it? What are the first off, how would you approach that? How do you make a movie for Burt Reynolds even after his passing? That kind of captures his spirit. What were your main motivations or main inspirations when trying to even do something like that?
Well, the idea kicked around in my head for a long time. And then when I finally sat down to do it, it came out a lot more fluid. But it was one of those ideas that kind of percolates in your head for about 10 years. And you never quite sit down to give it the time that it deserves. I finally sat down to do it. And Burt was alive when I was writing it. He passed away when I was about midway through the second draft. And I was actually heartbroken. Like, I had people, including my wife, calling me at work to say, you might not want to turn on the news today. So
I 100%. The first thing I thought was, oh, Devin.
But the guy was in his 80s. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Let's say it was sad, but it was not a surprise.
Exactly.
But I had written, there is a role for him in the movie, and the role still stands. I don't know who I would ever get to play it now. I would personally love to get someone that was in with Burt, you know, like a Chris Christopherson or Ned Beatty, someone who's still around that worked with Burt a lot. But it was written specifically for him, and so that character does not move around much and is really kind of permanently in a bad mood. But for my lead character, what I found as my inspiration was it was Gator. I kind of it started with White Lightning, and then it moved on to Gator, which he directed as well, by the way, the second Gator. And then there was Smokey and the Bandit right on the heels of Gator. And those three, to me, really kind of feel like a trilogy. You're actually watching that character go from ultimate badass to ultimate comic.
Yeah.
With Gator kind of standing in between. Being an action-filled movie with a lot of humor. And that kind of became the ground. Like, what would I do if I were to make a legitimate third Gator movie? And so I made him a little older. I said it in 1986 because I don't really imagine that character as a moonshiner existing past around that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I cast it as whatever age Burt Reynolds really was in 1986. I think he was about 50 something. I can't remember what it was. But my idea became, what if there was a guy that really did this stuff who Gator was based on? It was kind of a reverse meta move.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so there's even a reference later on. He met the love of his life, my character did, helping the FBI with something. And she was a reporter, and she got in with him and was fascinated by him as a subject, as a reporter. And I mentioned that at one point she renamed him to save his identity. His name in the movie is Slew, but she named his character Gator. So I thought, what would this guy be like who might actually be the real inspiration for Burt Reynolds' Gator? And writing it in a little bit more of a real world than at least Gator and Smokey and the Bandit take place in. White Lightning's a little more realistic. Yeah. But generally, the longer Burt's mustache got in those movies, the funnier he got.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually think, I mean, obviously, his more well-known stuff. And like I said, again, even though he's a terrible singer, like I love, Best Little Whorehouse. But I think White Lightning, White Lightning feels like a movie that Paul Newman could have been in, if you know what I mean. Like,
yeah.
I think that's definitely one of, at least like I said, in my limited viewing of his filmography, that's definitely in one of my favorite of his films.
It's in the top 5. White Lightning's so good.
Yeah, so good. And I love this the soundtrack or the score of the movie is actually really great too. Obviously, like you sit down and you write a script about, you have something in your head, like especially it's when it involves like a living person and specifically like a famous actor. Are you trying to, like, when you're writing it, are you trying to be like, I want to make Burt Reynolds happy, I want him to love this, or do you not even think about that? You're just inspired by the man and his work and trying to make your own vision regardless of whether or not he would approve?
Man, I thought about it constantly because I wrote him apart. And so in my head, it was always a matter of like, okay, well, at what point do I try to send this to him? Yeah. Because I'm obviously not too high up on the totem pole in terms of filmmaking, but there's a part of me that just thought I could probably get something to Burt Reynolds.
Probably, especially at the time that you were writing it. Yes.
I mean, if the guy who made Raven could get to Burt Reynolds, or some of his later movies, yeah, somebody was getting these scripts to them. Why couldn't it be me?
For real.
And so I was thinking about that a lot, and I wanted him to be conscious of it. I wanted him to appreciate it, and I that is even more than any kind of sadness I might have that Burt will never play the part that I wrote for him, I'm really more sad that Burt will never read it or potentially see the movie.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And that, the thing is, like, I know you well, and this isn't necessarily the first, like, this isn't sort of an even isolated incident in your life and your creative work, because you do have a tendency to sort of, whether it's Zachary or Burt Reynolds or whoever, like, you have a tendency to sort of latch on to and adore and really appreciate the works of, like, gentlemen, by the time that you've really discovered your passion for them, who are older and sort of in the twilight of their years.
Yeah.
Well,
sometimes they're just straight up dead. My Robert Mitchum movies getting lots of attention.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing, is I was going to bring up Robert Mitchum too. It's funny because quite like Burt Reynolds, Robert Mitchum was one of those guys. Even before I knew his name, I was like, that guy's cool. Like, I just have such a fascinating face. In fact, I have a weird thing. I don't know if it was Mad Magazine or. Growing up in childhood, I remember a caricature of Robert Mitchum in my head. But even before, like I said, before I knew his name or had even seen one of his movies, just something about his face. But so I was always a Robert Mitchum fan, just almost through osmosis, just knowing he existed. But I remember, like, you being very passionate about Robert Mitchum, to the point, and I remember the time you had either just read his biography or were reading it. But you have this infectious thing. It's something, like, I really like. I'm naturally attracted to people who are very, like, have an infectious enthusiasm for things. And I remember after I had one conversation with you about Robert Mitchum, and the next day I'm, like, trying to find, like, every movie I could find and stuff. And so it's very, which is funny because, I've always, like I said, I mentioned before, I've always felt like I've done that, like, I've been that influence in other people's lives when I get excited about something.
Yeah, you've been that influence on me too. It goes both ways for sure.
Well, that's good. I appreciate that. But the one thing is, like I said, where some people like, oh, I just discovered, an actor from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. You've always had this fascination with, like, the past, like whether it's Hollywood golden age or you just sort of you dive a little bit deeper than a lot of people, which I really appreciate because I'm sort of drawn to that as well.
I love things they don't make anymore.
Yeah, me too. I love I collect. I'm very attracted to anachronistic things. Like, I collect VHS. I'm actually right next to me is a TV VCR combo. I love records.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that doesn't exist anymore in mass production, I sort of am attracted to. But the one thing is, like, you do have, you have a tendency to normally love, or at least from my perspective, misunderstood geniuses. I mean, there's a lot.
The underrated.
The underrated, exactly. Just the underappreciated people who deserve more respect than they get. But now, Robert, having said that, Burt Reynolds in his heyday was, like you said, he was the biggest movie star in the world.
Sure. I don't think people understand exactly just how big he was. We were kids. We were aware of him, but we weren't aware of the level of stardom that he had.
No, I just knew that all my friends' moms liked him. I remember at the time, it's like, handsome men had mustaches. That's really, as I remember thinking as a kid, like.
Well, I think both of us are speaking to each other with beards partly because of.
It's not. It's probably not a coincidence, but so obviously, like, throughout the, like, late 70s, 80s, he was a big star, and then he did sort of start to wane throughout the later 80s and into the 90s. Upon, like I said, research when we were going to do this, like I said, there was a lot of movies in his later career I hadn't even heard of. Do you think there's any specific movie that maybe a lot of people don't know that you would say, like, this is a great Burt Reynolds movie that more people should have seen?
Oh, there's several. Are you talking about later Burt, or are you talking about? I was just going to say, I just watched what I consider to be his last film. If you look at his IMDb, he's got a couple more credits afterwards. But it was the last one where he played Burt Reynolds, and it was called The Last Movie Star.
Yeah, I was wanting to bring that up with you. So, yeah, so go on.
Well, I finally watched it today. I'd watched the first little bit of it when it was brand new. And I think I started to watch it before he had passed away. And I just got that feeling like, okay, I don't know if this is going to be any good or not, but it's probably going to make me teary-eyed on some level. And so it got tucked away until I was in the mood for it. And I guess I was in the mood this morning, just in case there was something I really needed to bring up in it. And I actually was really satisfied with it. I would say that people should check out his last movie. Don't expect anything particularly Oscar worthy. Co-stars Ariel Winter, and she's kind of doing her first big girl role, and she gets trapped in that same thing that a lot of very talented actors get themselves trapped in for their first, big person role, where, like, okay, you got tatted up and you got a Daisy Dukes on, and,
trying to be an adult.
It took me a little while to get past the fact that it was Ariel Winter, basically. And it wasn't so much that she did a bad performance. I think she's a talented lady, but it was definitely, it kind of felt like you're really trying to overstate that you're an adult now. But he was great in it. He's very sad in it. The movie literally starts with like the first scene, he's at the vet and he's told that he has to put his dog down. and his dog's name is Squanto, and he goes home with just the dog collar, and he's looking so sad. And then there's a poster on the wall for an old movie that Burt made, or his character made, that was called Squanto. The poster was actually for a real movie Burt made called Navajo Joe. But in the movie, this character, it was called Squanto, and you realize he just put down a dog that was named after his first movie. So it was very symbolic.
Gotcha. Okay.
And to me, one of the great highlights is his best friend in the movie is Chevy Chase. And Burt's character gets invited to the International Nashville Film Festival, which apparently should not confuse with the Nashville International Film Festivals. One's a big deal and one takes place at a bar. But he's getting the Lifetime Achievement Award at the one that takes place in a bar, and he doesn't know it yet. But he's asking his buddy Chevy Chase, who I don't think is ever named in the movie, so you just kind of assume it's Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase is trying to convince him to go, like, oh, you should go. I've totally heard of this thing. This is a big honor. You're given the Lifetime Achievement Award. You have to go. And Burt says something about, like, yeah, because you made so many great career decisions. And seeing these two take the piss out of each other for career decisions, these two particular actors, was worth the price of admission right there. And it is on Amazon Prime right now, so.
I will say, because I saw the trailer for it, and it looked like one of those movies that, like, could be good, even though you can tell maybe the director is not the most experienced filmmaker, and again, it script's a little saccharine. But I remember seeing it and being like, is this director a fucking masochist? Like, he's choosing to work with two of the notoriously grumpiest actors to ever walk the earth in their twilight years, which I'm sure has not made them any less cranky.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, but it looked like a movie I wanted to see just because I don't know if you ever saw that Sam Elliott movie, The Hero, which is actually a great movie.
No, I didn't see that one.
It's very good. I mean, Sam Elliott fucking crushes it. Sam Elliott is
he usually does.
Awesome. But it's very similar. But, there's something appealing about that. That's why, like, even like I'm blanking on the name, the one with Jeff Bridges, where he plays the older musician, older country singer. Like, there's something appealing about Crazy Heart. Thank you. There's something appealing about that story, about, like, somebody who's, like, lived so long, especially as we get older, somebody who was famous, who sort of had their best years are behind them, and they're sort of now at a has-been level, and they're trying to regain some sort of dignity or come to peace with their fading, whatever it is. There's something appealing about that to me. I don't know if there is to you, but the major appeal to it was that, like, I want to see Burt Reynolds specifically in that role, because he's so notoriously always carried himself with this sort of grandeur and this sort of ego and this sort of, like,
he checked his ego at the door on this one.
And that's what I wanted to see. I really wanted to see that. So
there's some great stuff. I'm probably overrating it at this point. There's some really fun stuff involving him and his previous characters. He's not playing Burt Reynolds. His name is
exactly
Vic Edwards in this. But there's a couple of points where he kind of hallucinates, half dreams, and he's actually in the Trans Am with younger Burt, speeding along, running into mailboxes and stuff, and he's trying to tell young Burt to slow down. then later on they do a very similar thing with Lewis in Deliverance.
Interesting.
He's on the canoe when Lewis is shooting the fish with bows and arrows, and telling him about how you don't beat this river.
Yeah, this is the best line in the whole. Yeah.
Yeah, and they turn that whole thing into a metaphor on life and fame and success. And so there's some tender moments. And the director wasn't a complete nobody. It's Adam Rifkin. He actually did stuff in the 90s. Yeah, he did The Chase with Charlie Sheen, which
I know.
Yeah, and Detroit Rock City, both of which I really enjoyed and thought.
I'd be honest, I don't know if it was the film quality or That's not what I would have thought, but interesting. That's cool. It's interesting.
Well, it makes sense that he was inspired by Burt Reynolds too, and he made his own wall-to-wall chase film.
Yeah, exactly.
So he was clearly influenced by Burt there. I do want to bring up. I just have to say this is one of the lists that I brought along because I just do find this fascinating. The roles that Burt Reynolds did not get.
Yeah, I know. This was my thing I was most excited. This is especially. I think a lot of people. I know some of them, but there's a lot that Yeah, why don't you go ahead and share that list?
Okay, well, because everyone knows, there's White Lightning, Gator, Smokey and the Bandit, Sharky's Machine. He did a lot of iconic stuff. And sure, we could go off on that for a long time too, but I am always kind of interested in the what ifs.
Yeah.
And here are a couple of what ifs for you. He was up for Guy Woodhouse in Rosemary's Baby, which I think he could have done just as well as Cassavetes in that role.
I think so too.
60s, I think he would have been fascinating in that. He was also up for Duke Forrest in MASH, which was the part that Tom Skerritt went on to play.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think he would have been great. It would have put him in another football movie, essentially. Because there's elements of almost Longest Yard sort of moments to MASH, the movie. Superman and Superman was kind of a fun one.
Yeah, no, that's one I've known because, growing up as a giant comic book nerd, there was this magazine called The Wizard Magazine, and they would always do. And I remember when I heard that, I was like, "What the fuck?" But that, honestly, and again, I have a picture of Burt Reynolds in my head, but as I've gotten older and seeing a younger Burt, like what was it, Bonanza, whichever Western show he sort of came out on, but
yeah, he was on Bonanza.
Yeah, a young, handsome, mustacheless, well-built Burt Reynolds. I was like, he probably could have played a damn good Superman, actually.
He could have. What I've heard about it was that they, Superman was made by the Salkings. I can't remember their first names. The Salking family, and they took it to Warner Brothers. They bought the rights to the character, which would never happen nowadays. That just a couple of schmucks would buy a property like Superman and take it to Warner Brothers. But they were definitely put the cart ahead of the horse type producers, and they already had a one sheet before there was a script. The one sheet was the classic one that says "You won't believe a man can fly" on the poster. And Richard Donner basically said, "I've seen Burt Reynolds not fly enough times that I don't believe Burt Reynolds can fly." And
that's true.
And I think that was a good point. And while I can go either way with the MASH and the Rosemary's Baby parts, I do have to say Christopher Reeve was correctly cast.
Absolutely. No, in fact, I think in the history of comic book cinema, I think it's one of the most on the note perfect castings there's ever been.
Because there was no ego to it. To get an unknown, they couldn't even get an unknown to do Batman in the Tim Burton movie. I mean, it really. Nobody was ever quite able to pull off getting an unknown again. Yeah.
And he had worked, but he wasn't a household name. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm with you. I like those what if worlds. So the idea of a world where, like just thinking about an actual Burt Reynolds Superman movie to me is interesting in the same way a Nick Cage Superman movie actually existing was interesting to me. But there's some movies on this list. Feel free to continue this list because there's some movies on this list which will blow people's minds.
Well, there's also the fact that Jack Nicholson has 2 of his 3 Oscars because of Burt Reynolds.
Yep.
Because Burt Reynolds turned down both One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Terms of Endearment.
Yep.
It had to be rewritten. In terms of endearment, the part had to be rewritten to suit Jack Nicholson because it was written, the astronaut was Burt Reynolds. It was written specifically for him by James L. Brooks. And he turned it down, I think, to do Cannonball Run 2.
Yeah.
He was dedicated to Hal Needham, man. We'll bring up Hal Needham here before we completely exit the show. But just to list off the last couple other ones here, the big maybes. Of course, Han Solo in Star Wars, which he turned down to do Smoking the Bandit, which was a lucrative career decision. And again, I think Harrison Ford probably was the only person to do that perfectly. John McClane in Die Hard.
Yep.
Which would have been interesting. I don't know if that would have been better or worse, but it would have been interesting. James Bond. He was offered James Bond after Sean Connery left.
That's right.
So,
and that's, I think, one, again, thinking of I think he actually could have done that really well.
It was before he grew the mustache. I mean, if you look at him in movies like Hustle or Sam Whiskey, he could have done that. I don't know.
Absolutely.
I never heard him do an accent.
And that's the thing is, that's the only thing is I can't even imagine him trying to do an accent. I think it would have been a Kevin Costner, Robin Hood kind of scenario. But again, he has the quality, like that sly, cool, that like bravado, that like effortless cool. Like, I mean, it definitely. Again, I wish I had access to a reality where I could buy that movie. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been very interesting. He ultimately passed on it because he felt that James Bond should not be an American.
Yeah, which is probably accurate.
And was probably also him covering for the fact that he had no fucking clue how to do an accent.
That's exactly right.
And then the last one I'll mention, because, I mean, really, the list does go on and on. But I do think it was interesting. He was up for Michael Corleone in The Godfather.
Yes.
Which... I mean, there's nobody else but Al Pacino for that. You know, we all know that now. But I do have a theory on why he was chosen for that.
Okay, yeah, I'm very curious to this.
Well, what we do know is that Marlon Brando said he would not do it if Burt Reynolds was offered the role, which I believe. But why they would offer it to him in the first place? Well, first off, they weren't thinking about casting Italians when they were first casting The Godfather anyways. That was part of the Pacino problem, perceived quote-unquote problem. Coppola really wanted to go with full-blooded Italians, and obviously it was the right thing to do, because as it's pointed out in The Kid Stays in the Picture, nobody had ever really done a mobster movie that was Italian. It was usually Jews playing Italians.
That's right.
And I think the reason they went for Burt Reynolds initially, you got to remember, this is 1971, so this would have been 69 or 70 when they were casting it. So Burt Reynolds was not a big star. He would have been a B-list star doing an A-list picture. But you try telling me that Burt Reynolds in 1969 does not look like he could play Marlon Brando's son.
I can actually picture, especially they have very similar hairlines specifically too. Like, I can see that.
I think that's why his name was on the table. It wasn't on the table because he was a big star at the time. You know, it was not a box office decision. I think
it was
they wanted him because he looked like Brando.
I could see that. That's actually pretty astute. I can totally buy that. I mean, first off, I mean, this is something I bring up all the time. Like, you know, first off, I think a lot of people, they have a, you know, Don Juan DeMarco, Island of Dr. Moreau vision of Marlon Brando in their head. But, you know, he was actually in heavy makeup when he did The Godfather. He was still a handsome man at that point.
He was not that old.
No.
Just like Von Sydow, I don't think ever finally got to the age that The Exorcist was.
Yeah, exactly. In fact,
or he did eventually.
I've been on this massive Max von Sydow kick lately, actually. I've always been a fan, but I've been trying to like see especially all this stuff with Bergman. But yeah, I was even just thinking of that. That literally was in my head was The Exorcist, and what a great age makeup that was. But you know, if you're gonna play Marlon Brando's son, you better be a good-looking motherfucker, because that dude, like, the most handsome man. That's even to this day, I say it all the time. Like, people ask me, like, oh, well, you know, like, we get a discussion. Who do I think is one of the most attractive men? I'll say Paul Newman, but young Marlon Brando is the most handsome dude I've ever seen. Like, it's insane. So even And it's always one of those unfortunate things when you see him then and then see him at the tail end of his life, and you're like, wow, what the fuck happened?
Sure.
But again, like I said, if you're gonna play Marlon Brando's son, you better be a pretty handsome dude. I'm not saying Al Pacino is a mutant, but I'd never say he was known for specifically his chiseled good looks or whatever. But again, I do think the right actor won the role.
I do. I agree.
I think Pacino did pretty good with it.
I'm willing to bet that Burt Reynolds' Godfather would have been a very different movie. Not just in terms of the performance. I think the script probably would have been different.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's an interesting what if.
Absolutely. So, we talked a lot about him as a person, and then your relationship with being a fan of his. As far as the work itself, are there any movies you specifically feel like people like through the whole start to finish, like what you consider like his best movies, or the movies that people should definitely like sort of revisit of his and give a second chance or a first chance and actually see?
So many of them we've already mentioned. I would say White Lightning and Gator are probably my go-tos. Like on a Sunday afternoon, just hanging out, wanting to watch a Burt Reynolds movie. Those two are probably the two I'm going to go to. Smokey and the Bandit's always fun. When Burt passed, they showed AMC reran Smokey and the Bandit theatrically for there was a couple showings over the course of a week. And which is ironic now because they'll never do that. That was a Universal picture, and as we sit here right now during the coronavirus, AMC will not show Universal pictures.
That's right.
But I took my my little girl to go see, and my wife, she had never seen it either, to see Smokey and the Bandit on the big screen as their first experience. My little girl loved it. She was 10 at the time, and she still, whenever we get in the car and I'm driving, she makes me put on Eastbound and Down on the radio. So,
really? Yeah.
Yeah, she has me turn on the Jerry Reed.
Yeah, that's actually, that song has a special relationship with me and my friend Adam. When first, I don't even know how it came up, but somehow Eastbound and Down. One of the first things we started talking about. So even to this day, we will sing that song to each other. But underrated song. Once you get that shit in your head, it will not leave your head.
No. And Jerry Reed was just that way. And we'd have to mention Jerry Reed because he was, I think, the most underrated collaborator that Burt Reynolds had. I mean, Ned Beatty got nominated for Oscars. Sally Field won Oscars. People that worked with Burt quite a bit. Charles Durning. They all got a considerable amount of recognition for stuff they did without Burt. But Jerry Reed was fantastic in Gator. Definitely worth seeing. Another one that they did together, in fact, the first one they did together, I think is one of the more underrated Burt movies, was called WW and the Dixie Dance Kings.
I saw that on his filmography. I had never even heard of that movie.
It was, first off, it was Jerry Reed's debut, playing a guitar player in a band. Burt is WW, and he joins up with this band, the Dixie Dance Kings. And it is about as politically correct as anything else that you could put Dixie in the title of. No, maybe that's unfair. It's just, the horn honking and like if that stuff offends you, which I certainly get, this is maybe not the movie for you. But it's not.
I think
a movie
people still
about,
need to accept that, like, times are different, and like it. Yeah.
But he's a con man. WW is a con man. He's on the run from the law, and he finds himself in a dance hall, and he pretends like he's with the band, and the band basically pretends like they're with him, and to cover him, and he talks them into being their manager, and he takes them on the road, promising he's going to get them at the Grand Ole Opry. It was shot in the 70s. I think it was the last movie John Avildsen did before he directed Rocky. And so it was shot in the 70s, but it takes place in the 50s. The music is all 50s and that kind of, country western when they all wore the same outfits and that sort of thing. And so they're making their way to the Grand Ole Opry, but robbing gas stations along the way to make money to get their rhinestone outfits and stuff. And I really think it's one of the starts of the Burt persona. The badass driving, the awesome car. He has this amazing Oldsmobile in it. It's like black and gold. The music, a lot of the elements that you would expect in prime Burt Reynolds really started in this movie. So if you ever get a chance, it's not out on DVD. I'm imagining because of rights issues. Some of the music is Elvis music, things like that. But it is on YouTube, so you can find the whole thing on YouTube if you're adventurous enough. That one's definitely worth checking out. Another one that I watched recently that I thought was really good was Hustle. And the cast of this thing was, I think, around 75. It was probably one of the last movies he made without a mustache. But he's a detective and a homicide detective in Los Angeles. His love interest is Catherine Deneuve.
Okay.
Yes, playing
already sold.
Playing a high class hooker living with the homicide detective. So there's some good. And what's funny is for half the movie they have like way too healthy of a relationship. This being their dynamic. So that's kind of what was fascinating at first. But yeah, it's got those two, and then Paul Winfield is his partner.
Nice.
Not Warren Oates, the other guy that was in Wild Bunch. Oh God, won the Oscar for Last Picture Show. Ben
Johnson.
Ben Johnson, yes.
Yeah.
So you got Burt Deneuve, Paul Winfield, Ben Johnson, Ernest Borgnine. It's just an incredible cast.
That's a good cast. Yeah, exactly.
And
I'm already sold.
And it's very, very small speaking roles. Probably the first ever speaking roles of Fred Willard and Robert Englund.
Really? I didn't know that. Really?
Yeah. In fact, Robert Englund is billed ahead of Fred Willard in the movie. Very small parts. Blink and you miss them. But it was a detective movie, and it was directed by Robert Aldrich, who did Longest Yard with Burt, and prior to that, had done like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and The Dirty Dozen, and is legitimately one of the great directors. And it's gritty. It's got elements of hardcore to it. The George C. Scott film.
Oh, it's one of my favorite fucking movies of all time.
Imagine Ben Johnson in that kind of a role, trying to figure out what happened to his daughter. And Burt.
Oh, that's really what the.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Burt's the detective who there's a body found in the beginning. I don't want to give away too much, but that happens right at the beginning where Burt finds this body. Ben Johnson's the father. He's not happy with what the Bureau's ruling on the cause of death was. So he kind of goes after the information himself and gets himself landed in some trouble. And meanwhile, Burt's having troubles with his high-class call girlfriend and back and forth. Eddie
Only in the
Albert's
70s.
Yes. It's a very 70s movie, and it has plot holes you could drive a Mack truck through. And there's certain things that are set up that you're just like, what the? Like later on you realize, oh yeah, weren't they supposed to be at the airport to stop a terrorist at one point or something? But it's never really followed up on. So it's not a perfect movie, but damn, it was interesting. And the performers and their performances is just wonderful. So if you ever get a chance, that one's called Hustle.
I'm gonna, as like I said, I don't know if it's on streaming or whatever, but I need to see that immediately. Like that sounds like right in my alley.
I don't think it's streaming anywhere by subscription, but it is streaming by rental.
I'll have to check it out, man. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, definitely worth checking out. I think we should mention something about the fact that he was a director.
Yeah, I don't think that's something that most people think of when they think of Burt Reynolds. I think. He mainly directed things that he was in. Am I right?
Yeah.
What are some of was there anything specifically from his directing career that specifically stands out as something that's worth your time?
Yeah, he didn't direct that many of his movies. He directed a lot of TV.
TV, yeah.
And that's including TV movies as well, like movie of the week type stuff. And a lot of that stuff, I'll just confess right out, I never bothered to watch. But in terms of his theatrical films, I think they're all worthy of mention because there is Gator. That was his directorial debut. The End with Dom DeLuise, which is one of the funniest movies you'll ever see about suicide. Not perfect, but it is him and Dom DeLuise and Sally Field at it again. Sharky's Machine, which I think is really...
Which is, I was wondering, because I know we brought that up in the past, and I know that's one of the ones. I don't even know. I could have sworn I'd seen it, but then, like, looking at his filmography, I'm like, I don't know if I actually have seen Sharky's Machine.
That one's worth seeing. That one, I think, kind of got swept under the rug a lot. I think that was one that kind of got thrown into the bargain bin, and people just assumed it was bargain bin material, but it's actually a really good movie. Another one, really, really good cast. I would say that if you're going to watch, if you're going to have a Burt marathon, Sharky belongs in there.
Good.
And the last one I'll mention of his that he directed is Stick.
Oh yeah, Stick. I think I own that on VHS.
It's probably the best way to own it. I got it on Blu-ray for Christmas, but I'm the exception to all these rules.
It's funny because it's one of those things where, like that era, so like mid '80s, kind of like direct-to-video action films are one of my sweet spots, and so and add Burt Reynolds to that mix, because that's probably right around the time when his light was dimming a little bit.
Things were fading. It wasn't direct-to-video, but if it had come out maybe 5 years later, it would have been. I'm sure.
Yeah, the thing is, like, I don't remember ever seeing it on TV. I don't remember it being. I mean, '85. I was still a pretty young kid, but my only recollection with that movie is seeing it on video cassette. So,
well, as a fan, I mention it because I don't know that I would recommend it to somebody who just doesn't like Burt Reynolds to begin with. Which is kind of true with a lot of these movies. You got to take them with a grain of salt. Occasionally something comes along like Stick where it's like half of a good movie, and then the second half falls apart so epically. And the reason I bring it up and why I give Burt the credit for it is because he claims that was the first time the studios really stepped in and just stepped all over his material. They basically wrestled the movie away from him, and he was at a point in his life where he was more inclined to say fuck it and let him do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because like you said, didn't have the cash that he had once had. Yeah,
he probably could have fought it. I think there was a cash problem. There was probably also a painkiller problem. He was on a lot of stuff right about that time. But when you look at it, though, you can see where he was going with it. And I finally read a quote from him about it, wherein he essentially said, "If you liked the first half of Stick, then you would have liked my second half of Stick." And that's exactly the part of the movie I like, is the first half has so much promise as a decent Burt Reynolds movie. And then it just kind of goes flying off the rails and becomes completely cartoonish.
Well, we'll give it this. It does have one of my favorite, like the VHS box cover art with like the broken window, you think you got the machine gun or whatever, like just the cover art alone makes you at least want to give it a chance. Devin, this was awesome. This was actually I feel like we could talk about Burt Reynolds for like another hour, but I think we'll spare the audience at this point. But yeah, this was a lot of fun for our first episode. I think it was the perfect choice. I pat myself on the back choosing today's topic, but
and I just straight up give you a hug for picking this one because you threw me an easy one.
Well, that's the thing is, like, you inspired it, so it's all you. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. I hope whoever ever listens to this enjoys it as much as I enjoyed recording it. But yeah, we should do this pretty soon. Was there anything else you want to say before we call this one?
No, I think we've said about all of it.
Perfect. Well,
you've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. You know, it's remember the wisdom of Burt.
Well said. All right. Well, until next time, you guys have a great rest of your night and stay safe and healthy.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Bye.